Welcome to Project-Based Python. These tutorials will not cover Python basics in depth. If you need help with the basics, you can try PyLearning Companion. It is a Python study app that covers all the core concepts in short lessons, then tests your skills with hundreds of activities. PyLearning Companion is available on Android and iOS. You can find the links in the video description. Today we will create and modify a database using SQLite. We will then connect this database to the username and password project. We will use SQLite, classes, and modules. This video uses code from the GUI Username and Password project. You can find all the files by clicking on the source code link below. Let's get started. First, we need to import SQLite. So let's do that with import SQLite 3. And now we can create a connection object that will represent our database. We'll call it connection, and it will equal sqlite3.connect. And now we need to pass in the name for the database. We'll call it users.db. And in our folder here, we can see that we have GUI Username and Password, which is the file we'll use later. Then we have users database, and that is the file we're working on right now. So once I run this, it will add users.db to our folder. So right now we have the database created, but there is nothing inside. And this users.db file will be used as our database. Now we need to create a cursor, and that will allow us to execute SQL commands. So the cursor will allow us to create tables and modify them within our database. The database on its own doesn't really do much without tables. So think of the tables as the containers of the data that we're going to be using. So let's create the cursor. We'll say cursor equals connection.cursor. And that's all we need to do. Next, we need to create our table. So we'll use the cursor for that. And by saying cursor.execute, we now have access to the SQLite commands. And we can simply use quotation marks to enter these commands, but since this one will be a little bit longer, we will use a docstring. And docstrings allow us to use multiple lines. So here, we're going to say create table. And create table is enough to create a new table. And we can call it users and then pass in the parameters. But we're also going to add if not exists. And if not exists allows us to run this command several times without getting an error. If you have a table that is called users and then you try to create another table called users, you will get a crash. But adding the if not exists allows us to call this command as many times as we want. And this will be useful later. So now inside of the parentheses here, we need to pass in the different values that we want to save in this table. So we're going to save a username, password, and an email. So username, text. The text here refers to what data type we're entering. So username will be a text data type. There are 5 data types in SQLite, but we are only going to use text for now. Then we'll have a password. That will be text. And saving a password this way is not a good idea. You want that to be encrypted, but since this is a little demo, it really doesn't matter. And then we'll have an email, and that will be text as well. Our cursor.execute command is not complete yet. So before we can run this and actually make changes to our database, we need to make sure that we commit those changes. So we need to say connection.commit. And this will save any changes that we have made to the database. And then we also want to close the connection. So connection.close. And closing the connection is just good practice after we're done making any changes to the database. So running this now creates the table, but we still don't have anything to work with. So we want to add something to our table next. We are not going to use a docstring this time, so we'll just make the changes in one line of code. So we'll say cursor.execute, and now in this line the command is insert into. Now we need to pass in the name of our database, or the name of our table, so that is users. And now we need to say values, and pass in a tuple of values which contain the username, password, and email. So we will just say John, and then for the password we'll say password1 at. The reason why I'm making this password1 at is that we have certain conditions that we need to meet in our GUI username and password. So I just want to meet that condition right away. And then for the email, we'll just say jj@gmail.com. So this will create a user in our users table. We also need to make sure that we commit these changes. So connection.commit. And I will get rid of this for now. I will just comment this out so that we're not running this over and over. We really don't need to at this point. The table has been created and saved, and we will use this later on. So if I run it now, we have created this user, and now we can query our database and we can actually get some values out of it. So let's do that next. Before we query the database, I will just comment this out as well, so we don't create the user every time we run this. And now we can use our cursor.execute and use the query command. So we will say select star from users. And what this will do is it will just, so star will get all of the values that we have saved in our users table. And now we can do something like cursor.fetch1. So fetch1 will get the first value. Fetch many, we have to pass in how many we want, and it will get that many values. Fetch all will just get everything that we have in our table. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So fetch all. And I'm going to pass this into a print statement so that we can print it to the screen. So print and cursor.fetchAll. If we run this, we get a list of tuples with the values inside of them. So we only have one right now. So there is John with the password and jj@gmail.com. Let me quickly add one more so that we can see what that looks like. So instead of John, I'll say Sam. I'll keep the password and let's say sam@gmail.com. So if I run it, now we have John, and that is the first tuple. And then in the second tuple, we have Sam with all of the data there. Before we go any further, let's just clean up our code a little bit. So we're going to take all of these SQLite commands and separate them from our Python code. So up here, I will have a string called add user, and I will set it to the command down here. So cut that, add user, and now this will still do the same thing, but now if we want to make any changes to the SQL command, we can just go to the top of the code and it will allow us to make those changes. I will also do that to the create table. So I'll cut this, create table, and we need to pass in create table here. And for the query, we'll do the same thing. So cut that, and we can say get user. And then down here, we need to pass in get user. So this is just a little bit cleaner. We have access to all of our SQLite commands up here and our Python code down here. We're also going to make a change to our Python code. So we're going to get rid of this cursor here, and instead we're going to use a context manager. So we will say with connection.execute and create table. So this will handle these two commands here. So it will create the table and then it will commit those changes. We no longer need to have that down here, and we no longer need a cursor. So we can do the same thing for adding a user and for getting the user. So we'll say with connection.execute, add user, get rid of this, and then with connection.execute, get user, and then we'll say fetch all, And we also want this inside of a print statement. For now, we're going to do something else later. So we'll say print and pass that in there. Get rid of this. And let me just comment these two parts out because again, we don't want to create a table again and we don't need to add any more users. But running this will now show us the two values that we have in our table. So we have the John and Sam values in there still. We're almost ready to import this database into GUI Username and Password, but before we do that, we should turn everything into a function so that we can call it whenever we need it. So instead of creating this connection, we are going to create a function. So def connect, and we will return the connection to our database. So SQLite3.connect users.db, and we can get rid of this line here. Now here, for creating a table, we're going to write a function and we'll say def create table. We need to pass in a connection, and then we need to tap this in and it will all stay the same. So with this connection, we can do connection.execute create table. Let's also do that for our add user. So def add user, and we also need a connection, and tap this in. And finally for the query, we'll do the same thing. So def get user connection colon and tap this in. And then this connection.close, we're actually going to turn that into a function as well. So we'll say def close connection, pass in the connection, and tap this in. Let's quickly test our functions just to make sure everything works right. So we'll create a connection here, we'll call it con, and it will equal connect. So remember, when we call the connect function, we return a connection to our users.db database. So here we have that connection. Now we can get a user, and we need to pass in the connection. And we'll also close the connection afterwards. So we'll say close connection and pass in the con. So this will do exactly what we had earlier. So we'll open up a connection, we'll get the users that are in the database, print them to the screen, and then close the connection. So if we run it, here we are, we have two tuples inside of our list. The first one is John, the second one is Sam. Next, we need to change how we add users. So first, let me move this down so it looks a little bit nicer. So everything is in order. We have create table, add user, get user. We don't want this part to be hard-coded. We don't want Sam password and Sam at Gmail every single time we add a new user. So to pass some variables in, we can simply use question marks. And there are 3 because we're getting the username, password, and email. Now down here where we say connection.execute add user, we need to pass in a tuple with those values to replace the question marks. So here I will just use one sample where we hard code it, and then we will actually accept those 3 values in here and then pass them in. So first let's create Jane, and for her password we'll say password to at and Jane at msn.com. So before we get the users, I will create a user. So add user and pass in the connection. Once we run this, we get John, we have Sam, and then we have Jane. Now all of this works fine, and now we can take the next step to actually have variables that are passed into the function, and then those variables can be passed into the SQLite command. So passing in variables is really nothing new. We've done this before. So here we'll say name, or actually let's say username, password, and email. And then instead of hard coding everything down here, we will pass in the username, password, email. And now when we add a user, we need 3 more arguments here. So here let's use Frank. For the password, we'll say password to at again, really doesn't matter. and then we'll have an email, so frank@gmail.com. So if I run this, we have John, Sam, Jane, and here's Frank with the password and the Gmail account. So let's remove this line here so we don't add Frank again. And let's go to our GUI username and password. So let me just run this to remind you what this looks like. If you did not do this tutorial, the link is in the description below so you can just get all of the code. But essentially what we're doing is we're getting a username, we're getting a password, making sure that the passwords match, and then we create the user. Now, if we enter a user that is already in our list, we get a message saying, please choose another username. So that list is up here. So we are hard coding that list into our program, and it is the same list every single time. What we're going to do now is we're going to replace this list with our database so that the list can continue to grow, and we will also, at the end of it, add the new user to the database. Before we can import the list of users, we need to make sure that it looks like this. So it needs to have each username separated by a comma inside of a list. And to do that, we need to rework our getUser function here. And let's actually call it getUsers because there are more than one. And right now, if I run it, remember we get a list of tuples, and each tuple contains all of the information associated with each user. So we get the username, the password, and the email. We only want the username. So we're going to create a for loop. So for I in, and this right here will return the whole list. So I will cut that out, paste it up here. We are going to print, for now, let's just print I. So what this is going to do is it will print each tuple under one another. So if I run it, we get all of the different users with their passwords and their emails. Now to just get the username, we need to say I and then get the 0 index value, which is the first thing in each tuple. So if I run that, we get John, Sam, Jane, and Frank. Now instead of simply printing all of the names, we're going to create a list to contain them. So here we'll say users equals an empty list, and then for each user, we're going to append that list. So users.append and I, and then the index value of 0. So that will add John, Sam, Jane, and Frank to a list. And we don't need this print statement, but we will print the users just so we can see what that looks like. And then we're going to return the users list, which we will then pass in here to take the place of this list. So let's run it. And we have a list now that contains all of the names that are already in the database. And we can now replace the hard-coded list with this database list. So first we need to import this user database.py as a module. So we're going to import it up here. We'll say import users database, and then we need to call the connect function because we need to establish a connection. So we need to do this down here. And let me comment this out because we don't want this happening once we import the module. So we need to connect, we need to get the users, and we need to close the connection. So here we're going to say our connection equals users database.connect. Then we need to create a table just in case this program is running for the first time. We know that it is not, so that table exists, but if this program was being used by somebody else, they wouldn't have this database file and they wouldn't have a table, so they would get a crash if we don't create that table first. And also the if not exists command now becomes useful because we can run this as many times as we want and there won't be a crash. So we can say users database dot create table, pass in the connection, and now down here, instead of this hard-coded list, we're going to get the list from the users database. So we're going to call this function here. So we're going to say users database dot get users, pass in the connection, and at the bottom, let's just not forget to close that connection. So we'll say users database dot close connection, pass in the connection. And we're ready to test this out. So if we run this, now remember, originally we had Sam, Frank, and Jane. We didn't have John in the hard-coded list. So let's try John, and this should tell us that the username is already being used. So yeah, we get please choose another username, and we actually get it printed to the screen because here we have a print statement. Where is it? So we have a print statement here. That's why we're getting this list down here. But we can get rid of that later when we don't need it anymore. So let me stop this for now. And let's clean up a few more things. So here we're creating a users list, and we're calling it users data, or we're getting the users database get users. We don't need to create this list really. We can just cut this, get rid of this list completely, and then down here when we're actually checking whether a name is in that list, we can just get the list there. It just shortens our code by one line, doesn't really do much, but you know, let's not create a list when we don't need one. Also, up here we have import users database. We can do something a little bit nicer. We can say import users database as DB. Now, instead of having to type in users database here, we can just say DB every time, and this will just make typing it in and using it much easier. So we can just say DB instead of users database every single time. And then we need to start looking at adding a user to our database. So once all of this is passed and we get the sign up successful message, we want to add the user to our database with the add user function. And we also need to make sure that we're getting an email from the user. Now let's just run this one more time so we can see what it looks like as a reference. So we have the username, password, and the confirm password. What we're going to do next is we're just going to move the submit button down, and we're going to add one more field where we get the email address from the user. And that is very easy to do. So we're going to go down here, and where we have the submit button, we have that in row 7 at the moment. We're going to put that in row 9, and then we're going to put the output in row 10. So we're moving everything down by 2, and here we're going to create a box that contains the email address. So we'll say email box equals entry. It goes into our window. Width will be 40. Background will be white. And then email box dot grid to place it, and we're going to put it in row 8, and column will be 0. We also need to add another label, so let me just copy and paste this, and the label will say email. And then we also need to make this row 7. So if we run this now, we have this extra field, so we get the email, so we can enter an email address. Now we need to actually add that information to our database. So what we're going to do is we will go down below all of these if statements and check what the value is in our output. So the output should say sign up successful. Sign up successful is only achievable if all of these conditions are met. So we're going to say if output dot, and now we're going to use the cget method. So cget will allow us to get any values from the output, and we're getting the text from the output. Okay, so cget text, and if that equals sign up successful, let's make sure we spell it the same way, and if that is true, we can use the function in our database, in our module here, the add user function, and remember we need to pass in the connection, the username, the password, and the email. So what we need to do is we need to say db dot add user, and then pass in the connection, username, password, and then we're going to get that email out of the email box. So email box.get, and then we are just going to get the users to print it to the console, just so we can get a little confirmation. We can do something else with this later, but this will show us that we were successful. So db.getUsers connection, and let's try this out. So now I will create somebody called Tim. The password will be password to at, and then for the email I'll say timtim@gmail.com, submit, and we have a sign up successful. We have the original list, so this is before we created Tim, and now we have the new list, which has John, Sam, Jane, Frank, and Tim. And let's perform one more test here. So we're just going to run this one more time, and I will use the same information here. So I'll say Tim, password, and this can be anything. So this can be 3 exclamation mark. The password doesn't matter. It's the username that we care about. Password 3 exclamation mark, and then timothy@gmail.com. And now if we submit this, it should tell us that we need to choose a different username. So submit, please choose another username. And let me actually change this to Timothy. So that will add Timothy to this list. And then I'll try Timothy again, just to show that this is working the way we want it to work. So Timothy, submit, sign up successful. Timothy is in the new list. If I try that again, we are getting please choose another username. So everything works as it should. Let's just make one last change before we stop, and I want to change this get user to get users, just to keep everything consistent. So we're going to make that get users, and let me also mention that if we run our program and let's say we create a new user, we just say Bob, and then password can be password 1 exclamation mark, and then I don't enter an email. This will be accepted, and now Bob is in our database, and the database will just have an empty field for his email. We can make that change inside of our program here. We can have something where we have some sort of error message if the user hasn't entered an email, but I'm not going to bother with it right now. We can have an empty value for an email address. It's not really going to make any difference. If you have enjoyed this tutorial, make sure to like and subscribe. Also check out PyLearning Companion. The link is in the video description. You can also find the source code below.